Hey everybody, this is Jake Wynn, public historian, here with my co-host Justin Voithofer, also public historian with the Gettysburg Foundation. We are back with you for episode 4 recap of Masters of the Air, this fantastic miniseries taking place on Apple TV Plus. Justin and I have been joined by a number of guests through these recap episodes, but this episode we're doing just the two of us. Justin, how are you doing this fine
I'm doing
evening?
good. Simplicity is good. And yeah, Jake and I were excited to talk about this episode because we both had the same reaction after the episode, that being, hey, this has been the best one yet. And it's kind of, I know we left it on a sour note after our last episode, but I think we can say the series has kind of got us back on course and excited for the future. So to recap, episode 4 of Masters of the Air, first thing is we have the experience of the escapee. We saw him a little bit in the previous episode. We didn't really have a background on who he is, William Quinton. We see him landing in Belgium in the previous episode, but this episode you finally see him and what that experience is like for the airmen. He connects with the Belgian underground. You see him go through a pretty kind of, you would think, nice and easy interrogation, if you want to call it. It turns out of the 3 that were supposedly found, one of them turned out to be a German spy, according to the Belgian resistance, to which they said, we never make mistakes. William kind of took that one a little bit hard, or not hard, but surprisingly, because, he talked with him all the way up until then. So you see that. And then this episode jumps back over to England. You see the first crew to hit 25 missions, their return home to base, the celebration that goes on. But then also during the celebration, you're reminded that they're celebrating because this is unique. They say during the party, really, out of the original 35 crews that landed, that made the initial jump from Greenland and all the way over to England, only 12 were remaining at that point. So it reminds you of the sheer attrition that goes through the 8th Air Force and specifically the 100th. During that party, you're introduced to who I hope is going to be a main character going forward, Rosie Rosenthal and his crew. He's a replacement crew coming in to repair or refill some of those losses. So you see his experience and kind of, and it makes a funny thing they make during the episode about how, hey, if they're throwing a party for 25, this doesn't really bode well for us. But then also that you start to see the cracks form in the 100th. You start to see the cracks with Major Egan and even Colonel Chick Harding during the party. You can kind of see in a little bit of tensious kind of moments, them asking about what we would call PTSD, but that they called that time flak happy. And it kind of bodes or leads you into the rest of the episodes. The rest of the episode goes through. Egan goes to London. He's coming to grips with his role. He's trying to mask the pain that he's feeling, and he ends up staying with a Polish, I guess, what would you call her, Jake? Refugee, or I don't know how you would call her. She had to flee Poland at the beginning of the war. Her husband was either killed or captured over there. It's probably killed. We don't really know for certain. But he starts to get to see a different side of what the war means to her and starts to contemplate what the war is meaning for him too. While that's going on, the 100th bombs Bremen again. This is the second bombing of Bremen, and you get it from the ground crew's perspective. You're not up in the air. This is the first episode that we see that they don't have fight scenes in the air, and I think that's great. We'll talk more about that later. But then at the end of the return of the bombing of Bremen, you finally find out that Buck Clevin and his plane was shot down, as well as Harry Crosby's, you think, is shot down. But if you listen to our couple episodes before, you know that he survives at least, but you don't know what happens here. And we're excited to see how they kind of loop that in. And then finally, at the end, you see Egan walk through the streets and notice a bombing in London, and kind of grappling with his own thoughts on that. He presses the button, the bombs fall. He's never thought about the receiving end of all the damage that he is doing. He hears the screams of, I think, the mother that is standing outside of the destroyed building. And then he also finds out that the 100th and the 8th Air Force smashed Bremen again. He sees the tremendous losses that's reported in the newspaper. He then calls back to the unit, and then that's where, through a code, they tell him that Clevin has gone down, and you see him immediately spring back in action and say, okay, we're going to be back, and it kind of leaves you on that cliffhanger. So Jake, that's a quick recap, I guess. It's easier. You do that better than I do, man. That's hard. What are your thoughts on the episode? What did you think? I know you texted me beforehand, before I even watched it, saying it was one of your favorites so far. So what do you got?
Yeah, I think that was a great recap. There was a lot going on in this episode, despite the fact that we were never in the air. In this, which has been the first three episodes, we saw a lot of air combat, a lot of air operations. This episode, we are on the ground most of the time, and I actually think that it served us very, very well. As I texted you, as you just mentioned, this was definitely my favorite episode so far. We're building characters. We're seeing the dynamics between the airmen, the civilians on the ground, American Red Cross folks on the ground. We're getting to see kind of the full range of people who were participating in the air war, not just the pilots, the crews, but also the ground crew that we've talked a lot about, and some of those other figures that were around on base. And we're also seeing a lot of the anguish that's being caused. We're seeing new guys show up and then disappear, which was very common. The survival rates for those crews on their first mission was not very good. Without the experience, they were particularly in a bad spot. I particularly liked the scenes that we saw in London. I think Major Egan and his struggles with kind of being unhinged, and losing his mind. He's definitely showing some of that. Like you said, flak happy. Combat fatigue is another word that they used at the time. What we would probably call post-traumatic stress disorder today. And his scenes with the Polish woman were just so gripping. I mean, not to mention the kind of passion between these two people that had just met. We see a reality of wartime England, wartime London, which is I'll get more into that in a little bit later when we talk a little bit more of the historical background for this. But then we're also seeing, as you mentioned, kind of Egan on the other end of the bombing. We see as he's having this long conversation with this Polish woman about the morality of the war and what the war is all about, as a bombing raid is taking place right outside. And this is really episode. I think I really like this episode because it really gets into the issues at play here and the thoughts and perspectives of all of these different people with different backgrounds all being kind of thrown together in a very small place. So we're seeing, Major Egan, who comes into this as the hotshot pilot, who's kind of losing his mind as he's watching his friends disappear and going into combat day after day after day in the skies over Germany. And then we have this Polish woman who has probably lost her husband, lost her country, sees the absolute monstrous behavior of the Germans in her home country, and the fact that she's just like, Germans, kill them all. I don't care what happens to them. They've done terrible things in Europe. They deserve everything that they get. But then you see the other side of that when Egan walks outside and sees the aftermath of German bombing in London, which kind of goes on one hand. It's like, well, this is what the Germans are doing. This is what, in many ways, they started with the Blitz on London back in 1940 and 41. But then you're also seeing, this is a civilian. This is a woman who's screaming because her child has been killed in the bombing. And he knows that he's been doing this exact same thing to German children as well. So it's all of this balancing act that this episode does very, very well. And this, honestly, for all of the kind of pessimism that we talked about in the last episode, where we were like, the air combat was amazing, but we're not getting a lot of the story and the character development. This episode makes me very excited and hopeful for the rest of the series. Justin, what do you think?
I couldn't agree with you more too. And it's funny when you talked about that. He's grappling with the fact that this is what he's doing to German citizens too. I will say we're probably going to even see that more in the next episode without getting too far ahead of ourselves. Up until this point, you think of the 100th missions of what we've described. They're bombing sub pens. They're bombing the Messerschmitt factory. They're not bombing the center of a town yet, and we'll see that change very interestingly. So I'm really excited to look forward to that and see how Egan will kind of come to grips with, okay, now we're doing to them what they're kind of doing to the Londoners and that stuff too. But no, exactly what I was hoping for as well. You have that ground perspective. I love just standing on the control tower with Colonel Harding too, counting them as they come back, standing with the ground crew, counting them as they come back. I love that you don't see and maybe we will in the future, but you don't see Bucky Clevin go down, which I think hurts more because you don't see his, if it's going to be a heroic struggle or whatever. But we'll get to the story here, and we'll see how they kind of incorporate both his story and a few others coming forward. But yeah, you see the cost. I mean, they count it: 8 lost, 8 planes down, 80 men gone, day done, and then they're going to get at it again the next couple of days too. So I think that's something you see in this episode that I was really, really excited for. And to your point too about I think we were pessimistic. The things I've kind of reminded myself this past week as I thought more about what we talked about and as I watched this episode is I think it's sometimes and this would be me in particular, before I rush to judgment on this, I got to think of how I watch Band of Brothers, right? I watched Band of Brothers back to back to back to back. I did not have a break. I did not have a week in between it. And you kind of know at the end what happens to them at the beginning. So, the character development, you kind of have your glasses looking at the whole series as opposed to individual episodes. So that's one thing I think that I at least want to give them a benefit of the doubt. And this episode did kind of reaffirm my hope that, yeah, they're on the right track and you're going to care about these folks a lot going forward. But yeah, I once again, I think at the beginning, the first episode we talked about, one person I hope to see represented is Rosie Rosenthal. You see him introduced here. He's a lawyer before the war. He's not a pilot. He comes over, he's green, and he sees the elephant for the first time, just like everybody else did. But I think the thing that's great about it is by not focusing on what happened in the air, you're sitting in that briefing room or the interrogation room after the mission with them, trying to figure out what happened. I thought that was a great representation of that room, better than what we've seen it so far, because you are in there also trying to figure out what the heck happened during the mission. You didn't see it for your own eyes. They didn't just depict it during the show. So what kept, and I watched it back again this week too, what kept coming up to me was how many times they ask about parachutes. And I want to point out that they are asking about parachutes because they care about their friends. They want to have hope that they at least survived the crash or they got it out of the airplane. And if you look back on these episodes, when you watch them back, pay attention to how many times they're talking about parachutes and how many times they're trying to come to grips with, okay, maybe they were shot down, but there's hope that they're still alive. That's what they're kind of looking for in those interrogations, and also trying to understand what happened during the mission too. So I thought the interrogation kind of room and the post after action report room that they're going through, it was well represented during this episode for sure. And then, we talked about the ground crews. Crosby talks about the ground crews a lot. He talks about how great they are. And he also talks about how vital the Red Cross girls were on at Thorpe Abbotts. And I thought that was great that they showed her here. I forget the name I off the top of my head, but Crosby is very, very complimentary, I guess is the right word. I couldn't think of it for a second. He's very complimentary of them because they went through it. They were up late the night before, and then he would say, kind of like you see in the episode, the first face that they see or the last face they see before boarding a plane is them. They were always put together. They were always on time. They were doing the right thing. So I kind of am glad that we've kind of checked the boxes of every single group that supports something like the 100th Bomb Group, whether that's the civilians, the Women's Land Army, now the Red Cross girls too. I think that that's just a great thing for the show to do, to show that it is a group effort and kind of highlight them and what their experiences are in certain ways. And then, lastly, we mentioned, flak happy, battle fatigue, PTSD, whatever you want to call it. It's interesting to kind of compare and contrast this. We always bring up Band of Brothers, and whether that's good or bad that we keep going back to that show, there is a episode in Band of Brothers called Breaking Point. And this seems to be, this next couple episodes are going to be the quote unquote breaking point episodes. This is going to be when the war kind of changes for them, and you see the impact on the day-to-day nature of going through something like this on an average soldier. Band of Brothers, we kind of got that near the latter parts of the series. This, we're getting it right up front, right in the beginning, which is interesting because I think that'll kind of show. I'm interested to see how they go the rest of the series. And then one thing I'll say before I pass back over to you, Jake, too, is that these next few episodes, these are if you read Masters of the Air, if you read Harry Crosby's book, if you read anything on the 100th, this is one of 3 missions that are going to completely change the 100th Bomb Group. So I guess to kind of build up dramatic anticipation, this was number 1. There'll be 2 more. And at the end of that 3rd mission, you're going to see it in the next episode. And it's going to, even based off the trailer that we saw at the end, I think it's going to be really good. But with that, Jake, I'll pass it back to you. Do you want to talk about So what did we kind of see during the episode, history-wise? We saw Bremen, we saw London, we saw a lot of things. What were some things you want to point out?
Yeah, definitely wanted to point out a couple things that I thought were interesting. The showing of London during the war, I kind of figured that that would be something that we would see somewhere in the series. Chances are we'll probably see it again because London was only 90 or so miles away from these bases, so it was very close. And these guys are very close by to London. They're going on passes like we're seeing Major Egan in this episode. So London was an international city. If you read just about any account of London during the war, you get this kind of vision of it as this place with men and women in all different uniforms of every country on the planet. That this was a place that they referred to as the Paris of the war, kind of referring back to World War I, when Paris was kind of this international city where everybody who's who was there and hanging out during the First World War. London is that in the second, and we get a little taste of that with the fact that they show Major Egan is going out with this Polish woman. And we're seeing a Polish woman who is either, as you mentioned, Justin, maybe she's a refugee or she could actively be serving. There's Polish military forces in London, Polish kind of government in exile. And we get reference to the Polish Air Force, which I think is really fun because I'm glad they did this because it's kind of one of these stories that gets kind of forgotten in the whole blitzkrieg of Poland in the first weeks of the Second World War. But the Polish Air Force, despite being like totally outnumbered and the equipment they had was way out of date in comparison to the Germans, they actually showed up and they didn't do a terrible job considering the odds. And a whole bunch of them survive. Unlike this woman's husband, who likely died, as she says, who's probably rotting in a potato field somewhere in Poland. A huge bunch of these guys actually survive, end up escaping, end up in France, if they survive combat with the Germans again during the Battle for France, then end up in England and actually participate in the Battle of Britain. And those that survive the Battle of Britain continue on. So there is a sizable Polish component that is serving in England during this time. Of course, they're going to be betrayed by the Allies, and the Soviets are going to kind of roll over Poland a little bit later in the war, and that's a really sad element that I'm sure we're not going to see in this series, well outside the scope of this. But I love the inclusion of the Poles here in this. And the other component I wanted to touch on was the bombing of London that we see. And this is kind of this like misnomer about something that I say misnomer, like this is something I thought, like the Blitz takes place in 1940 to 1941. And that's when the heaviest bombing is taking place in London. But that's not the only time. There are continuous bombing raids that are taking place, like up until the point where the Allies push the Germans away from the coast of France and Belgium. There are still bombing raids on London that are taking place. They're not of the size and scale of what was happening back in 1940 and 41, but they continue on. And then even once those bombers may not exist any longer, or their bases were overrun, then in 1944 and 1945, the V1 and V2 rockets start pummeling London and other cities within England. I think it's great that they showed that. I think it was a very clever way to get at the damage that's being done by these raids and what the realities were for those civilians on the ground that were experiencing this. So those are the kind of historical pieces that kind of that stuck out to me. I will kind of put in a little note for the future episode, which is I'm actually going to be traveling to London next week. So the next time you see us, I'll actually be recording that episode. Fingers crossed. Hopefully, recording that episode in London. So kind of excited to be in the place that we're going to be talking about and seeing some of the damage that was done, seeking out some spots that experienced bomb damage during the war. So maybe talk about that in the next episode. But yeah, so Justin, I know we wanted to kind of take stock. We've done this with our guests, thinking about how do we feel after 4 episodes, and we've talked a little bit about this, but I think directly want to ask you this. So, how do you feel after watching 4 episodes, and how are you feeling about where this show is going?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you would ask me this question, or if we would have backed up an episode, but I think we would have said, "Oh, I might be jumping around. We might be focusing on way too much." But then right here, you get the sense, okay, good. It's humanizing these folks. It's not jumping around. There's storylines you can follow, and I think that as we talked about these next few episodes, 4, 5, and 6, I think are going to be kind of the meat and potatoes of this whole series, and that's before we even jump to the Tuskegee Airmen. How we're going to do that, I'm not sure either. I hope it's a seamless transition. I hope it's not rushed. I hope it ties in somehow. I think it's a great story to talk about this team, and I'm really excited about it. My biggest hope is that they're just going to end one and just jump to something and provide no kind of context or no kind of storyline between the two of them. But we'll see. I don't know. That's what's beautiful about this thing, is we're doing it week by week and not at the end. So it gives me great anticipation that the rest of the series is going to do it right. And we see these stories play out. Now we've kind of focused on our main characters, right? We're talking about the Clevin and the Egan as one thread. Rosenthal is another thread. The plight of the shot down airmen trying to get through occupied Europe as another thread. And then it sounds like the Tuskegee Airmen will be that last one. So I can kind of handle that. I can handle all of those 4. Jake, what about you? What are you kind of looking for the next couple episodes?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. I think we're seeing the show making this turn now that we've started to develop some of these characters. We're starting to learn more about them, who they are, what they're made of, really, seeing them being pushed to their limits. I think that moving forward, these next couple of episodes are going to be really crucial to where the show ultimately goes. Just listening into the really excellent podcast that's kind of accompanying this, that the World War II Museum is doing with a lot of the producers and the actors. Tom Hanks was on there. Donald Miller is on every episode. It sounds really like they are buttoned up in terms of the history, and making sure that the tie-ins that they're making are legitimate, real, natural story progressions to be making. So I think that's the one thing we can say about this. We had some quibbles about the last episode, in terms of it being television. But one of the things they've done a really good job with is the accuracy and trying to give an accurate portrayal of this history, of the experiences of these guys. And I think, moving forward, it looks like we're going to continue on that path. So hopeful for that. Excited for the next couple of episodes, and pretty excited to be able to be watching some of these while actually in the UK, where a lot of these stories are taking place.
Well, as I told Jake earlier when he initially told me he was going to be in, he's going to be England. He's going to be our Edward R. Murrow reporting back from overseas. So his voice is going to be great. He's going to be, narrating the hustle and bustle of I guess you'd call it wartime London, to make sure you get your voice ready, and we'll get you, plug
This
in with the
is the
BBC.
sound of London.
Play an air raid siren, it'll be great.
Exactly.
You'll think that you're right there in the blitz.
Our production value is going to ramp up these next couple of episodes. So,
all right. Well, thank you so much, Justin, for joining me again. I've been really enjoying these conversations that we've been having, and bringing in some of our friends and historians and pilots, and this has been really great. And we're looking forward to continuing on and bringing on some future guests as well that we're planning out for future episodes. Thank you all so much for tuning in with us. Please let us know what you think about Masters of the Air. Let us know in the comments below. If you've enjoyed these episodes, give us a thumbs up, and give us a follow, whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you find us. Definitely tune in, subscribe for some more. And we are very excited to continue talking about Masters of the Air on Apple TV Plus. And one more time, Justin, thank you so much. And we will see you all next time.